Welcome to Anthodish, the weekly show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. Today is October 2nd, and it corresponds with the beginning of non-GMO month. Non-GMO month in October raises consumer awareness about the GMO issue and supports the brands and retailers that have made a non-GMO commitment. I thought in honor of this and in honor of the many retailers, particularly around Toronto, that are celebrating non-GMO month through their merchandise and products and education and events, that I would air this particularly interesting episode with this week's guest, Brandi Bechard. Brandi is currently an amazing CSA farmer and the owner of a sustainable landscaping and garden coaching business. She originally hails from Windsor, Ontario, but has lived in cities and towns across Canada while pursuing contract work in environmental and natural resource science. She has worked in outdoor education, wildlife research, forestry conservation, you name it. When it comes to the environment, Brandi has loads of experience. After spending a couple of years in very specific fields, she felt that she wasn't making a significant difference and had to compromise certain values to accommodate her career path. So she moved back to her hometown and started a business teaching people how to grow sustainable food amidst a desert of conventionally farmed land. In our interview, we speak about her roots and inspirations that led her to farming. We break down some of the language surrounding organic and local foods and what CSA farming really is, because I know even for myself, that was something that I always was not totally clear on until now. She also speaks to issues of food security and access in Canada and shares more about edible landscaping and tips to help cultivate a stronger relationship with sustainable food sources for beginners. Brandi has so much knowledge and experience to share and is very peaceful to listen to. So I hope you learn as much as I did throughout this interview and start to think critically about where your food comes from and the farmers that are behind it. All right, here's my interview with Brandi. So welcome to the show, Brandi. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm great, Sarah. How are you?
I'm excited to talk about food with you today.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So today we're talking all about what you do and the food landscapes that you create. So before we jump into the meaty parts of it, can you give us some background on who you are, where you're from, and some early influences that might have shaped your interest in food or farming?
Sure. So yes, before I start talking about my edible landscaping and what I'm currently doing, I guess I'll just give you a little background on how that got me here. So I grew up on the outskirts of the city of Windsor, Ontario, which is located in Essex County. My family and I lived on the edge of the city with neighbors close by, and there were some big box stores just down the block, but surrounding us were fields of conventionally farmland. And that farmland primarily produced oil, seed, and grain crops. So it was really just fields of golden grain, the classic Americana style. And I actually remember growing up and thinking that farm fields were what nature looked like. So although we are surrounded by some of the most fertile land in Ontario, and our climate is capable of growing apples, grapes, peaches, tomatoes, my family mostly purchased our food from the grocery store. And so I, as a child, just thought that's where food comes from. And although my dad did have a garden, which I always loved, it became too much work for him and my mom with having a full-time job and 3 daughters. The garden really just ended up getting converted back into a grass lawn. So I think it wasn't until my teenage years when I started scrutinizing my own food choices and really understanding the ramifications my food choices had on the land. So I started to travel and see what other parts of the world look like. And I also became really interested in environmental issues. And so naturally, I became aware of issues with our current food system. So it really wasn't so much early romanticized memories of picking tomatoes in the garden that inspired my current passion for sustainable food, but rather a realization that there was a lack of these early connections with food.
That's so interesting because that's particularly like when you think of farming and, farming origin stories, it's very much that like picturesque childhood of growing up around vegetables and growing gardens.
Exactly. I would love to tell that story, that like I had an Italian neighbor that showed me the ropes of growing like the perfect tomato, but I don't. And it wasn't until I was a teenager, started forming some of my own ideas with my impact on the world that really became present to me.
And that's really cool, especially growing up in Windsor, you said, right? Or around Windsor?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's like when I think of Windsor, I don't necessarily think about agriculture being like super big in that area.
No, well, not Windsor, the city itself, but surrounding Windsor, Essex County, and then Leamington is actually like a behemoth of food production in Ontario and Canada. So we were around it, but it never really directly impacted my life until now.
Nice. And when you were in high school, did you find like, were you taking courses that kind of illuminated these issues with food sustainability and access? Or was it just kind of like you were doing your own research and stumbled into this?
You know what? It wasn't so much courses on food that helped shape my ideas on how food affects my life and in my surrounding environment, but actually environmental courses. And being an environmentalist, you cannot look too far without running into some issue that is directly related to food. Most environmentalists won't focus on one tiny aspect. It's very much so an accumulation of different issues that will form what we're looking at. And food is definitely a huge factor in how we use our environment, how we interact with it, and how we restore it.
Nice. And it's definitely, as you're saying, like it's such an interconnected, as an environmentalist, there are so many different factors. So it's like a much more holistic approach, I'm sure, to even looking at food and where food's role is in the bigger system.
Definitely. And a holistic approach is a great way to describe that.
I think that's like my favorite word as an anthropologist, to be honest, too.
Yeah. Pretty unnecessary.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, do you currently run a CSA farm, or have you in the past?
Yeah, so this is actually the first farm, wait, let me think. Yeah, this is the first farm I've worked on where I have participated in a CSA program. And I don't own the farm. I work on it with another farmer. Him and myself run the program, just the two of us.
That's so cool. So can you share with listeners what exactly a CSA farm is? And like you mentioned that you grew up around conventional farms. So what's the difference between a conventional farm and a CSA farm?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm glad you're asking that question. Because I think CSA sometimes intimidates people because they're like, oh, well, I've never grown up with that type of way of acquiring our food. So it might not be something that people are willing to experiment with now, just because it's not always around. But when you look for it, it certainly is there. Every town I've been in, there's been some small little option of subscribing to a CSA. So let me talk about what that means. CSA stands for Community Shared Agriculture. When you become a CSA member, you're purchasing a share of vegetables from a farmer that grows food near you. So typically, CSA members pay for an entire season of produce upfront, and the price can range anywhere from, in Canadian, I'm really just guessing here, like $200 to $600, depending on what is offered in the shares. So this early season one-time payment allows your farmer to plan for the season, purchase new seed, make equipment repairs, things of the sort. And having signed up for a CSA, city and town residents have direct access to high quality fresh produce grown locally and often organically, which is usually harvested the day of delivery or pickup. We harvest our veggies the day of. Some root vegetables and overwintering crops can be added into your bins every week because they store well, but everything else has been harvested the day of, which is super, super important. This also allows the opportunity to get to know your farmers, to know who grows your food, and makes it much more special when you prepare the food for your family. Just, who grew it, where it came from. It also helps us farmers know what to plant and how much to harvest, because we eliminate the need to try and sell our goods at farmers markets every week, where sales aren't necessarily guaranteed.
Right.
other types of farm production may include selling at roadside stands and farmers markets, selling wholesale to grocery stores, or having a U-pick arrangement. Whereas conventionally farmed land, it's usually just monoculture. So they're not growing a ton of different crops. They don't have any diversity within the farms. It's usually just one crop for hundreds of acres. And that's basically sold wholesale to other companies that refine that food and then sell even further to other companies would distribute it or turn it into products like canola oil and bottle it up and ship it to the stores. So it's very much so a whole nother ballgame than conventional farming.
Totally sounds like it. And it's like everything that you're saying sounds so almost amazingly ideal in terms of how you're connecting farmers with consumers and making it a much more communal kind of back to your roots sort of situation than having that like monocrop and the distance between the farmer and the community.
Definitely. I think before mass agriculture like that really became popular in this part of the world, that's how people got their food. People just had gardens and you sold the excess to your neighbors or you grew your own. In pre-agriculture, we just foraged for our own food, which I'm sure people would have traded or bought with some sort of currency or exchange in other ways at the time. So yeah, mass agriculture really changed the way we get our food and the way we grow it, we trade it and consume it.
Totally. And I think like you're kind of talking about pre-agriculture too. And one thing, I have a background in archaeology and we had this really cool course that was talking about the collapse of complex societies. And one of the first sorts of indicators that a society is kind of not doing so well is that they don't have that resilient or flexible relationship with crops. So they are monocropping or they're relying strictly on a couple of things rather than kind of, reading what the community wants and needs and how that varies on a seasonal basis or year-to-year basis.
You really like struck a chord with me when you used the term resilient, because the food that we're growing is resilient because with interplanting crops, you're more resistant to disease and pest infestation, but the community is also more resilient to crop failure or trade failure, things like that. Like biodiversity just increases yields and increases opportunities to sell and consume and trade. It's just overall a more resilient way of growing food.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And it's very cool that, you're speaking about the resiliency of the plants, but also the people and how those kind of come together to form that healthier ecosystem of people and nature. And
oh, totally. Yeah. More crops is like an insurance plan, right? If one crop fails, it's not like your entire year is over. You have other crops to depend on.
Perfect. I like that. Insurance policy on food.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about terminology because I don't know a lot about farming, but I'm so fascinated by like the ways that foods are classified and understood. So can you break down the difference between organic food, local food, and other foods that listeners might come across at the grocery store?
Yeah, so these definitions are tricky and I'm going to tackle them the best I can. It's basically a set of rules and protocols that you have to follow in order to be certified. And those standards vary from country to country, but generally speaking, organic farming employs practices that recycles resources, such as composting, promotes ecological balance, and conserves biodiversity and water. And also this often includes restricting the use of pesticides and fertilizers that conventional farming heavily relies on.
Right. Yeah. So that would be a huge one too, right?
I mean, one of the reasons why using these terms is tricky because organic doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear. Like there has been no fertilizers, no pesticides, no insecticides ever used on this. That's not what that means. It just means that those products are also certified under the organic recognition program. So it's not necessarily pesticide free. It's just used with organic approved pesticides.
Oh, okay. That's really insightful. Like I actually had no idea about the details of the protocols. Okay. So local food. So what would you classify as local food then?
So local food means food that is grown close to where it's being distributed and consumed. This is a tricky term also because
Yeah.
distance is relative, right?
Very much
So
so.
when you say local, does that mean it was grown down the road or within Canada? Like, is it local because it comes from North America, not from South America? So we'll get more into that, but local food basically is just a descriptor of the distance in which the food is grown to where it's being consumed.
Fair. And a flexible definition, for sure.
Yes.
So then what sorts of other foods, if they're not organic or not local, would you find at a grocery store typically?
Well, I guess you could find food that really doesn't have any of these buzzwords, just plain old, like you could, for example, see a bag of almonds, and then right next to it, you can see a bag of organic almonds. You most likely wouldn't see local almonds unless you live in California or somewhere who has a climate that allows for those types of crops. But if these foods don't have a label on them, that doesn't necessarily mean they weren't grown using organic practices, or they weren't grown close to you. You just may not know it because these people haven't paid to use those words on their products.
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, so if you look more into the companies that you purchase food from, you might actually find that they are local to you, but since they distribute to such a huge population, distance-wise, they might not be local to somebody else. So they don't use that word because they might distribute all over the world.
And I think that that's something I kind of stumbled across when I was writing like a research paper on organic food, but I think it's so important to be aware of the fact that the label organic doesn't necessarily mean, or like not having that label doesn't mean that it's not organic food. It's just that process of paying for that term.
That's right.
Nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the guidelines and protocols in creating organic food. So what are sorts of the main guidelines that you would look to in order to grow and distribute organic foods? And does this differ significantly from any of the protocols that you would follow if it wasn't an organic farm?
Okay, so I guess firstly, I just should clarify that the farm I work on is not a certified organic farm. But I currently work as one of the head farmers on a farm that grows food using organic practices. The reason being is that we cannot be certified because of the surrounding conventionally farmed land and the effects that type of agriculture has on the land that we grow our food on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So I'm not sure how far in the future that it would have to go in order for our land to be able to be certified organic should the surrounding farmland also start using more organic practices. But there are lots of residual effects that land will have when considering food production. And so you have to just be aware that not necessarily, we could be using organic standards, but our neighbor isn't. And that has a huge effect on the food that we grow. So the guidelines that I look to are not so much the strict protocols and rules that need to be checked off in order to be considered organic, but more so based on my intuition as someone who intends to eat and feed my friends and family with the food that I grow. So I come from an academic background in ecosystem management and environmental sciences. And so I've measured the effects that pesticides and fertilizers have on our watersheds and have seen the amount of wildlife that has been displaced by clearing mass tracts of land for conventionally farmed land. I've eaten food in my garden that I've picked straight off the vine and walked around in the soil in my bare feet. And I've seen farmers wear full body suits and ventilating face masks to spray food that needs to be scrubbed with soap and water before it's consumed.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so I'm with the food that I grow every step of the way, like from opening a fresh packet of untreated seeds to planting those seeds in the soil, tending to the seedlings, watering, lots of weeding,
I bet.
and finally harvesting and handing that food off to my customers. Not once do we spray with anything we can't pronounce. We irrigate our crops strategically to avoid evaporation. Some other things we can do organically without being certified is to leave buffers along the roads and ditches to prevent erosion and soil loss.
Cool.
Other organic farmers will often develop crop rotation schedules, so different crops What that means is that different crops are being planted in the beds year after year, not the same thing in the same place. And that way, by rotating these crops, it's returning nutrients and carbon and nitrogen back into the soil. It feeds the earthworms. We love earthworms. We compost. We plant cover crops to keep the soil integrity, maintain soil integrity, and treat the soil like a living organism. These are just some of the practices that come to mind when I think about organic farming, and they're not necessarily all laid out so clearly when you're looking at like the standards of organic farming written by the certification party, etc. So that's just something that like I said, I use my intuition rather than a set of rules. And I'm sure if we were farming under an organic certification, those rules are way more important. You'd have to follow them very strictly. Sometimes it's complicated and not intuition based. So,
So I'd imagine there's like a little more freedom with the more intuitive farming, right?
Yeah. I mean, we would still, when dealing with complicated pests or fungal issues or something, we would still look to the actual certifying parties' guidelines to see, okay, if we are a certified organic farm, how would we deal with this issue? What steps would we take to make sure that we're doing it in a sustainable way? Because not everything is intuition based when it gets down to the nitty gritty, like chemistry of growing food. So there are guidelines to look to, and those are available if you look at your local certifying party in your area, because there's different organizations that certify organic depending on what region you're growing in.
Nice. Sounds like it's a good balance between the intuitive and then also like if you have those issues that you can come back to those guidelines and have those kind of help you a little bit.
Definitely.
All right, so let's go back to the idea of local food, because throughout much of your work, you focus on local food production. So we talked a little bit about how you would classify local food, but why do you feel it's important for consumers to know about local food and to use local food?
So I mentioned that local food can be tricky because distance is relative.
Yeah.
And I touched a little bit about that, but what I meant by that is that something that's grown in the same country as you can be considered local, and something grown in your neighbor's garden can be considered local, of course. And I personally have seen that term be stretched a little too far.
How far is too far?
Well, okay, I'll give you an example. So I've seen a local mom and pop type garden center label their tomatoes as homegrown, which I thought was really cool. I had the idea. They were Italian and they loved their heirloom tomatoes, and these tomatoes were beautiful in a bunch of different colors. And I just assumed that homegrown meant that it was grown in the store owner's garden because she had an amazing garden right beside the garden center.
Yeah.
So I was informed when I purchased it that what they meant by homegrown was that tomatoes were grown in Leamington, which is in the region, in a heated greenhouse, and they were driven to the garden center. Okay, so that is still pretty local, but not what I would call homegrown.
No, that's definitely, yeah.
So there's just certain words that you have to navigate around to understand what they really mean. Local can mean it wasn't shipped from Mexico, but it was shipped from the Okanagan Valley in BC. So for me, Canadian grown may be a better term for peaches grown in British Columbia and shipped to Windsor. I wouldn't call those local, but they are Canadian. So that's still a good step, but there's closer options. So this is what I mean by distance is relative. For me, I feel comfortable asking the store clerk or vendor, where was this grown? Do you have any garlic grown in Ontario? It just opens the conversation and lets retailers know that you as a consumer care about where your food comes from.
I like that a lot because it's something that, when you're shopping, even if you're at a farmer's market, you don't necessarily as a consumer stop to think about having those connections, but it takes you that one step closer. And, through those conversations, you kind of start to elicit a bit of a change in consumer demands and desires.
Totally. And it's not always about like busting the vendor, like, oh, this is not local. But sometimes it's about learning as a consumer that you might be buying strawberries from a farmer at a farmer's market and asking them, did you grow these on your farm? And you might learn that they actually had a crop failure for the strawberries, but they went to a nearby farm themselves and made a trade deal, and they're selling the strawberries for them. So although you might think at first glance, oh, this isn't even their own strawberries, well, there's more to it than that. So you just, it's okay to ask questions. People love it when you ask questions about their food, in my experience, and it just opens the conversation to learn about the trials and tribulations of growing food and what local means to everybody.
And what I like too about that, I mean, again, it's great because you don't know if you're allowed to necessarily ask questions. So it's great to kind of have that option, but also you get to ask farmers more about, how they grow things, but also like their own personal struggles and their own stories. As you were giving like the strawberry example, it's not just, the food that you're eating, but there's like the story of growth and production behind it as well. So that's really special.
Yeah, and with increasing threats on trade deals and things like that, in the political world, we might be asking those type of questions more often.
Yes.
Or we might not have to ask those questions. We might just have to assume that everything is grown in Canada because we might not be doing as much trading. There's just a trajectory that we can kind of predict, and it's just good to know who grows food where, because you'll have to get to them eventually.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, because that's something I think I saw a lot. I think it was last week. They were talking about like the different ketchups available and how you can identify like the most Canadian ketchup. So I think it's, obviously that's a much more processed example, but it certainly seems to be, with all these ongoing trade issues and concerns, a much more bigger conversation that's starting to open up.
Definitely.
Okay, so thinking about your own experiences or community members that you've spoken with, can you think of any challenges that you've encountered in terms of food access or availability for farmers? And are there any specific trends in terms of who faces the most challenges?
That's a really difficult question to answer, actually, because there's so much stigma around sustainably grown food. I feel like there's kind of an idea that sustainably grown food is a luxury that only the upper, middle, and higher classes can afford. In grocery stores, organic food is more costly than non-organic, and for many reasons that I sometimes don't even understand. But some of the things I do understand directly is that land is expensive, and organic certification is too. And this is why, in addition to farming, I also run a small garden coaching and edible landscaping business. I want to help people grow food in their own yards and communities, not just rely on it from the grocery store. So I offer my services at a reasonable sliding scale rate, so that people who wouldn't typically be able to afford these garden consultations or be able to afford organic food from the grocery store can choose what to pay for my services based on what they have and what they can afford.
Wow.
So I'm not a registered charity. I am trying to build a business, but for me, food can't be looked at as just a business. To me, it's a basic right, and it's something that can bring communities together.
That's so beautiful.
Thank you. I've made a lot of friends over connecting through food, farming, selling food, eating in general, like going out to restaurants, things that have nothing to do with farming, just food in general.
Yeah.
And so if I can help equip people with the skills to grow their own food, they don't need to worry about how high the organic prices are at the supermarket.
I love that.
And yeah, well, I mean, education is a huge part of what I do. The more people talk about where the food comes from, the more they see community gardens popping up and decommissioned parking lots and public land, the more they see that sustainably grown food can be and should be for everyone. And all someone has to do is stroll through Detroit and tour some of the amazing community garden projects going on in that incredible city. It doesn't take money and class and privilege to grow healthy food. It takes hands, hearts, community. That's why I think it's really important that we have conversations like this.
Yeah, certainly. I honestly, everything you're saying, I just loved. Like, that's such a beautiful, what you're doing is setting like such a beautiful example of how you can look at food and how you can make food more accessible to people that might not think that they can access those sorts of foods by teaching. which is especially I find with Canada. Like I think there was in 2012 the UN Special Rapporteur, I think, came to Canada and was talking about the right to food for Canadians because we don't have any legislature that kind of outlines the right to food for Canadians.
Mhm.
So to me, it's so interesting because you would think in a country like ours that we would have these sorts of guidelines and expectations about food being a human right, but it's very much not a discussion. Or at the time, I think Harper was in power, so very much not a discussion then.
Right. Well, also in a developed country like Canada, it's almost like we have, in quotations, bigger, better things to worry about other than food because it's just always assumed that it'll be around.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in countries that are prone to drought or political upset, there might not always be fresh, healthy food available. And so maybe legislation would be more important surrounding the right to food in those countries. And you wouldn't see it in Canada, but that's definitely not the case. There's definitely demographics here that still don't have access to healthy food. And I don't want to actually label the food as like organic or anything because we talked about how that sometimes can mean different things, but healthy food in general I feel can be in the hands of anybody who chooses to learn about it and how to grow it themselves. You can grow food on a balcony, or you can support someone who does have a property to grow food. It doesn't necessarily have to be their only source of income. If they do it as a side gig, you can support that. And that's a way that, they make a living and you eat healthy, you feed your family in a healthy way.
Yeah, exactly. And it goes back to the idea of like building a community around food and not having it be this like isolating trip to a grocery store where you don't talk to anyone and you just like go through the robot scanners.
Yeah.
Which always freaks me out.
Yeah, it is kind of weird.
Yeah. So okay, you've worked across Canada in many different farming regions throughout your life. So can you speak to some of the similarities or differences that you've encountered in terms of the landscapes or what sorts of crops that you can farm between provinces?
It's funny that you say that because the first thing that pops into my mind is the weeds. The weeds are always the same.
Really?
Yeah. So, of course, the crops we can grow are different, and how we grow them are differently. And so, for example, my first farming experience actually started in Ontario. I worked for the Toronto Botanical Garden, just helping out with some inner city / urban gardening projects, kind of teaching kids how to be in the garden.
Nice.
And I was, in turn, they were actually teaching me how to be in the garden, which often working with kids will do. They teach you more than you might be teaching them.
Oh my gosh, totally.
And so, but the first time I actually was working full on actually producing food, the focus wasn't education, it was producing food, was on Vancouver Island. And so that region of the world doesn't necessarily always get frost throughout the winter or snow. And so their seasons are far more extended than, let's say, that of even here in Windsor, which is the most southerly part of Canada.
Yeah.
We still get hard frosts and snow, and the humidity is really intense for plants, and the summers are super hot. And so you just have to tweak your approach to basically how long you can grow the plants for and what time of year you grow them. So, but aside from just climate, there's also been a certain demographic difference I've seen with people buying this type of food.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, so in Victoria, well, we were growing on the Saanich Peninsula, and we were growing food for a restaurant in downtown Victoria. So that was actually a really unrealistic idea of what I thought organic farming was going to be like, because we had a guaranteed market to sell to. We had the restaurant, whereas a lot of farms don't know who's going to buy their food that week. They don't know if their food's going to sell at the market or if they're going to sell out and not have enough.
Right.
Whereas, yeah, anyway, so the demographic of people I found on the island, they were more aware of organically grown food. They were more aware of CSA programs. The farmers markets were amazing. They were full. They were bustling with people Little kids were not afraid to come up and ask you if they could try a carrot.
Nice.
People didn't mind if the food was imperfect or dirty, or, if there was weeds in the salad mix. Like, I'm not saying that people on the island are better types of demographics to sell to. I'm just saying that there was more of it. There was more opportunity to sell it out there, in my personal experience.
Interesting.
Whereas the next place I went on to farm was Northern Alberta, and I just did that for a short time. I worked on a small organic herb farm, and that was very much so the opposite of working on the island, because we were selling all of our products online through shipping. And
Oh,
there
interesting.
so there was a lot less face-to-face connection. And so the best way that I can sell products is just by talking about them. I'm not selling them, I'm not pitching them an idea. I'm actually just talking about it in the way I would talk about it to a friend or family member. And people naturally are drawn to that because they can see that I'm passionate about it, and they can see themselves liking that type of food. Whereas online, you very much so have to sell it as if you're selling any other product. And the climate was so cold, and I didn't know any of the people who were receiving our products. So it was different in that way as well.
Yeah, that's like strikingly different, especially, when you think about shopping online, you think about, clothes or things that are pretty easy to return. But with fruits and vegetables and other produce, like personally, I would like to see it, touch it, talk to people about it. So that totally changes it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. You start to recognize the people who are buying your food, and you're like, oh, I don't think this cabbage can make the cut this week. I know that so-and-so is going to come and want cabbage, and I want the best one for them.
Oh,
right?
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really love that in-person connection. I understand that rural communities depend on selling online, especially if they're selling dried products like herbs.
Oh yes, of course.
And it's a huge part of their viability as a farm in those regions. But also growing organic food in a very oil-centric province was just something on its own to learn to navigate talking about that with folks. Yeah.
So do you mean like in terms of growing the food it was difficult, or in terms of like the oil-centric, I guess, attitudes of people?
Well, everywhere you go, you're going to find all sorts of people. So I hate to sound like I'm throwing a blanket over the province of Alberta, because certainly I've met so many supportive farmers there, and people who really enjoyed the food we were growing. But also I've had a lot more difficult conversations with people who didn't understand why I was choosing to do that when there was so much more money in other fields. Right. And so, they were working just as hard, if not harder than I was, but they were also living a more lucrative career. And they just didn't understand why Alberta has like fertile soils and a ton of, grade A beef, the best beef in the world, according to them. But to me, it was like, yeah, but I don't eat beef. So that matters to me, because it matters what my friends and family and community eat. But what directly impacts my life is growing vegetables and herbs and flowers and chickens and eggs and bees and livestock as well. But it's just grown in a completely different way than what conventional ranchers and farmers are used to. So like I said, the educational component was huge there, talking face to face in person, right?
Yeah.
But in these rural communities, you don't get as much of that. So it was just, there's just a little bit more resistance in places where it's not as common, like on the island.
Makes sense. And I guess it's also, I mean, when you think of BC, they tend to be people who are a little bit more environmentally conscious or aware of, climatic and environmental issues out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I feel like that must also kind of shape the types of people that are coming to the markets.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's talk about your edible landscaping company, because I think that's so cool.
Yay!
So can you explain what an edible landscape is and what sorts of plants that you would find in an edible landscape?
Sure. So for me, edible landscaping means, and I'm going to use this word again, building resilient landscapes.
Nice.
So traditional horticulture and traditional landscaping would often use ornamental plants to help shape a landscape. The plants are there to add texture, shape, and color to the landscape. And edible landscaping still uses these principles, but subs out the ornamental and sometimes even invasive or non-native plants with useful plants that benefit the environment and the people tending to it as well. So instead of using grass, for example, as a ground cover, one of the most common ground covers you'll come across, one can plant something like thyme, which is a plant that offers like a lovely aroma when you walk through it. Makes a really nice culinary herb. It produces pretty purple blossoms in the summer that pollinators love, and it still acts as a weed suppressor. It acts as a living mulch. It covers the ground with green, which is everything that grass does. So that's just one tangible example of how you can sub out edible plants or beneficial plants for traditionally ornamental plants. Also, edible landscapes don't necessarily have to focus on edible food, but more so beneficial plants. So plants, just like in a forest ecosystem, interact with each other. And so when you plant plants together that are designed to help each other out, they actually complement each other's roles in that ecosystem.
Cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's so cool. And the fact that you can have, obviously, like, there's so much thought that goes into these, but you create these landscapes that are far more interesting. They smell better. They probably look beautiful and serve a deeper purpose as well, I think is really neat.
Yeah, and so the reason why I don't use the term gardening is because often when people think of gardening, they think of a lot of work. So I already had mentioned a few times with exaggeration the amount of weeding it takes to weed out an organic farm, because we're not using pesticides, we're not using weed killers, nothing like that. Roundup, never come close.
Perfect.
And so yes, with gardening, there's a lot of work involved, and you're actually kind of battling the land. You're battling what wants to naturally grow there. You're battling with regards to resources, like adding to the soil constantly, watering it constantly. Whereas sustainable landscaping kind of incorporates what you already have on the property. So a designer would assess the land, look at the slope, look at the shade and sun, look at the soil type, and maybe alter things slightly to make it a more hospitable environment for an ecosystem to thrive. And then think of putting in plants that the people would appreciate and that the other plants would appreciate, and trying to design something that works as a whole system, a holistic system that depends on itself and recycles nutrients within itself, rather than constantly using off property resources, like buying mulch from the store all the time and buying fertilizers all the time. Even if they're organic, it's a closed circuit. It can sustain itself. So eventually edible landscapes kind of aim to be self-sufficient, low maintenance, like low input from humans, but maximum output from the landscape itself.
That's so cool. And it really speaks to like the amount of knowledge that you have to have coming into building those as well, right?
Oh yeah, I'm still learning. Like I feel right now that I'm going to listen to this podcast and be like, what was I rambling on about? But really I'm really trying to take to play here my experience working as a forestry consultant out in Alberta, working as an organic farmer in BC, working as an educator in Ontario. I've worked as a species at risk biologist in Ontario, just developing a career for myself and a role for myself that incorporates all these different aspects, but I get to use it in a way where I'm helping others and I'm not just exclusively depending on contracts and moving around the country following these contracts, but something that kind of is a marriage of all of the things I love to do. And I can do it anywhere, because everywhere I go, people want to eat and people have property. It's always going to be something that's going to be around.
Yeah. And like, regardless of whether it's in Canada or elsewhere, that's always going to be, like you'll always have something to create and to think about as well, which is super cool.
Mm-hmm.
So When you start, or I guess when you're first kind of coming into the idea of food sustainability, as someone who doesn't know a lot, it can be kind of overwhelming to think about that when you don't grow up with that knowledge or haven't been surrounded by that knowledge ever. So do you have some like quick tips or tricks for those who want to take their first steps towards seeking out more sustainable food sources?
Yeah, I mean, something really, really simple you can do aside from the vast information available on the internet would be just to go down on a Saturday morning and walk through a farmer's market. You don't even need to talk to anybody if you're a nervous type and just want to just see what's going on down there. Um, you can just, watch people talking about food, watch that, they're actually handing it, they're touching hands, like they're handing a loaf of bread to the customer and taking their money. They know exactly where that came from. They can talk about it. They can ask, are you going to have this next week? Just being around that environment kind of helps you understand that none of this food came from too far away.
Yeah.
And no matter if it's organic or not, or even if it was, grown half an hour away, some people don't have access to land right within the city and they need to grow an hour away and they need to drive in an hour every Saturday to reach their clientele. Just knowing that they worked so hard on it and this is what they wait for every week. You can start to see that food is so much more than something you just run into the store and put into your mouth. It's really something that we have to build a relationship with first if we want to start healing the way that we view the land, not so much as a resource, but more so as a gift.
Yeah, absolutely.
I really think about that often, like, especially in, the edible landscaping when I'm using plants that I might not reap the benefits of until the future, or I might not reap the benefits of at all myself. I might be planting a tree for the future generations. And that's something that's like, wow, yeah, but this has to happen because if I don't, then they won't have this. Right. And I'm not trying to sound too idyllic here, but really if I'm thinking about the stewardship of a property, if you want a large tree, even if it's not going to be like some romantic hazel tree, it's just a tree. That itself is not really going to be yielding results as far as shade or erosion control or water retention or firewood for like 100 years. So it's really about thinking in the future and yeah, anyway, I'm going on a tangent here, which I told you I was going to do if you get me on the subject.
But I love it. It's great.
really, I just, what I'm saying is that if you just talk to people about where your food comes from, do an internet search if you're curious, read a book. I can recommend a few different resources to look to and trying to learn about sustainable food, which I can mention either now or later or somewhere in
yeah, we can do it towards the end too if you want.
Yeah, so there's a lot of resource and I really think, if you join a CSA, if you go to a farmer's market, you'll start finding the inspiration there, and you actually might even start not knowing what questions to ask, but once you immerse yourself, they'll come to you.
Yeah, and it's so, I think when I first moved to Toronto, like I came from Peterborough, which does have a huge farming community, and I was very rooted there. So it took me a little while to kind of adjust to Toronto norms, and it was actually through the farmers market down the road from me where I started really connecting with people. And I'm one of those shy people that doesn't necessarily always go up to farmers and talk to them, but they'll talk to you. Like it's kind of hard to avoid because they're so friendly and lovely. And then you begin to build those relationships, and yeah, and like it just totally changes. You get excited about the food purchase because it actually has meaning to it. Like there's a story behind it and a connection to the earth that you don't get the same way in a grocery store.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even going on a farm tour, it just broadens your experience that much more. Just, talking to the farmer at the farmer's market is the first step. Going to visit their farm is the next. Many people are happy to show you around their property, to show you how they do things. I encourage my CSA customers to come and have a look at the farm. I would love to pick their food for them if they were to come and just see the farm. I'd just send them their bag right then and there. Like, let's go pick it together.
That's so fun. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
And people take away from that. Like they're going to remember that and remember like how that food was grown more so than in other ways of purchasing it.
Oh yeah, especially children too. Like it's
Yeah.
magic for them. Potatoes. Have you ever seen a child unearth a potato? It's just, you'll know what I mean.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like so special.
Hmm.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up, do you have any cool resources that you would like to share with listeners to kind of continue their learning about CSA farming and edible landscapes and all things in between?
Well, because CSAs, farmers markets, food share, co-ops, they're all specific to the region. Instead of giving you just a list of websites to check out, I would encourage you to do a little research yourself and just look up if there are any food CSAs in your area, or if there's a co-op. If there's not a food co-op, you can always think of starting one. A co-op is just something that a community can get together and do and buy food at wholesale prices. And you can afford the organic strawberry orders because everybody on your street pitched in to order it at the wholesale price, and then you divvy it up depending on how many people pick it up. It's just another way that you can get food that doesn't involve shipping it from across the world and driving to the grocery store and aimlessly checking it out. Things like that. So just check out the types of crops that are grown in your area, or plant a garden yourself. Like that's the number one way to start connecting with food, is to just plunk a seed in the ground yourself and watch it grow.
Yeah, and there's nothing more exciting than like watching a tiny sprout kind of burst from the ground.
Oh yeah, it's magic. It's a little bit of science and a little bit of magic.
Totally, I like that.
I'd also recommend a few books. So I love the works of Wendell Berry. He's an agrarian / writer. I was first introduced to it by one of the first farm managers that I've worked for out in Victoria. He gave us this book as a party gift when I left the farm. Wendell Berry writes about the trials and tribulations of farmers, the importance of farmers in society, how a lot of farming is chalked up to being for the older generations and hasn't really been passed on to younger generations, at least conventionally. And so that there's a whole new way of looking at farming with the newer generations who are taking care of the land now. Another really good book is called The Third Plate by Dan Barber. That's not so much just about growing food, but it's also about consuming it. I would recommend that to people, like anyone who's an eater, a chef, a farmer, someone who just loves to eat casually. I mean, pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
So if you just walk around at the bookstore and look in any section, there has to be some reference to food when you're looking to farming when you're looking in the cooking section, and vice versa. If you're in the gardening section, there's going to be recipes on what to do with your harvest, and it's just everywhere if you start looking for it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, those are some great resources. So thank you so much for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And where can people find you if they want to learn more about you and what you do?
So I will hopefully be having a website constructed soon. But right now I have both a Facebook account and an Instagram account. My Instagram account that I use primarily for my gardening business is called Boreal Brandi. It's spelled Boreal, Boreal, and then Brandi, which is Brandi. And there you'll find just little videos and tips I have on growing a garden, some pictures I have of my own garden and my clients', and just, some things that I find inspiring. And then on my Facebook page, that's mostly for people who live within this region, because I'm actually selling the food, promoting the farm share bags on there.
Oh, awesome.
I talk about, come visit me on the farm today from 10 to 4. I'll be here all day. Like, come and take off your shoes and walk around the farm with me.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, you can find me there. Just my name is Brandi Bechard. I'm sure it'll be somewhere on this podcast.
Yes, I'll put it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, so you can find me on there, and I would be happy to talk to anybody who'd like to reach out to me. I don't need to be trying to sell you my services. I'd love to just have a conversation with you, just like I have with you today, about food and what it is I do and what it is you can do to start being involved more in this really, really important cause.
Oh, well, thank you so much for coming on Anthro-Dish. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy farming season to speak with us.
I had a great time, and I'm going to divulge some secret information. This is my first podcast. I've never spoken on one before, so this is really exciting for me too.
Nice. I'm excited to be your first interviewer, I guess. This is a really fun conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
That was my interview with Brandi Bechard, a CSA farmer and the owner of a sustainable landscaping business. You can find the names of the books that she recommended in the show notes, along with her social media accounts. You can find her on Instagram at BorealBrandi and at Facebook at Brandi Bechard. Thanks again for listening to Anthro-Dish this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. And if you love what you're hearing, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on whatever listening platforms you use. You can find out more about Anthro-Dish at our website, anthrodish.com, or find us on social media at Anthro-Dish Podcast for Facebook and Instagram, and Anthro-Dish for Twitter. Thanks so much again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.